Okay, well, thanks very much for that great introduction, Andrea. And thanks also to Erin for organising this event. And it's really because of Erin that we're here, because Erin will be presenting her PhD tomorrow. So that's one of the main reason that I'm here. Really, this talk is just a little extra. So the last time that I was in Strasbourg was when I was about 14 years old, and it was when I was learning French, because I studied French at secondary school, and I speak French. I actually speak French at home. My husband is French, and we have a bilingual family, but I don't tend to give academic talks in French because I generally am not good at switching between tu and vous, so I usually, put my foot in it a lot of the time. So I prefer to maybe stick with English where you don't have those norms of politeness. It's kind of safer. And so when I was in France, when I visited Strasbourg, it was just one day actually, because I wasn't in France learning French. I was actually with a family living in a place called Bulle, near Baden-Baden, on the other side of the border. So I was with that family. They were living there in a kind of a French enclave. They were the two parents were working. They were in the military, and they were at that time, I suppose, when there was still the existence of the border between Germany and France in a kind of the post-war context. And so I used to go to the local swimming pool. I used to hear German being spoken. I used to go to the supermarket. German was spoken. But at home with the French family, it was like a French bubble. So it was, I suppose, a bit different to what you would normally associate with a French immersion experience. And so when I used to send postcards home, my friends used to say, a French language exchange to Bulle, but what? I thought you were going to France. Is everybody not speaking German? How can you learn French while in Germany? And I really began to wonder if I was having the authentic French experience, learning about the real French culture or what I'd learned about in books. So a lot of my school books at the time would have images of French flags, the Tour Eiffel, escargot, pain au chocolat. So all of the kind of stereotypical things that you would associate, or that the way France and Frenchness is sold abroad. I expect nowadays it would be kind of associated with, the life of Emily in Paris, or the Café de Fleur experience that Erin will talk about tomorrow as part of her PhD defence. So was the French that I was learning contaminated by German words? That was what I was worried about. The youngest girl in the household, she had been born in Germany. So she was bilingual German-French. So she would often throw in German words. She would code mix quite a lot. And I spent a lot of time with her. So I was thinking, is this the real French? Is she speaking real French? So I was quite worried about what I was learning. I said, was this a real French family? Were there real native speakers? Was I learning some sort of Deutsch as opposed to, was this Deutsch or Français, or what was it? And I suppose, although I didn't realize at the time, this experience is closely linked to some of the sociolinguistic questions that I'm now asking and that I've been asking for the past number of years. So questioning assumptions around language, territory, and nativeness. So to learn to speak the real French, do you need to acquire the French language in its purest form? Do you need to go to France to be in French territory? Do you need to engage with authentic French native speakers who are living in France, preferably Paris, as opposed to Picardy, for example, or Strasbourg, and certainly not Germany? So these were questions that began to emerge as I began to look at the assumptions around language, nativeness, and territory. So this is, I was just flicking through the internet there before I came and, looking to see what kind of websites are out there when it comes to learning French. And this was one that struck me, said, this is all about learning French in French-speaking countries. So there's a whole list of different countries where you can learn French linked to the broader context of la francophonie. But if you just, look at the way it's advertised, this is the landing page. It couldn't be more territorial. You see the map of France and the Eiffel Tower. So it is no way representative of the French-speaking countries of the world. So globalization and transnational movements and migration and digital advances have changed the way in which languages move around, in which the way speakers move around. And so it's not unusual to find different linguistic resources in different countries, in different contexts. So you will find French speakers in Germany, you will find Irish speakers living in Dublin, you will find Polish speakers living in Edinburgh. And while it's often accepted that globalization can be a factor that leads to the dissolution of minority languages, this is a complex type of context. So language loss is not always the outcome. And minority languages are also being spoken in cities. We often associate minority languages such as Breton, for example, with rural areas, but it's actually been spoken in cities in the same way as Irish is being spoken in Dublin. So in the city of Glasgow, where I work, there are as many speakers of Gaelic as there are in the Scottish Highlands. So often people, when they think of Gaelic, they'll think, oh, I need to go to the Scottish Highlands and Islands, to some isolated island in the north coast. Whereas in Glasgow, there are approximately 10,000 speakers of Gaelic. They don't exist as a very tightly knit community, but they exist. There are as many speakers of Irish in Dublin as there are in the traditional Irish-speaking Gaeltacht. The Gaeltacht is the Irish-speaking part of the country in the west coast, and the number of Irish speakers outspoken outside Irish is far greater than the number of overall speakers of Irish in the whole country. So there are lots of Irish speakers in the diaspora. You will find Irish speakers in New York, because of lots of people who have immigrated, and also because there's a great interest in learning about Irish culture, and people, decide to learn a minoritized language because they're interested in the culture. So it's not only in Ireland that you have Irish speakers. In Wales, we find a similar situation. Welsh is a minoritized language in Wales, but it's not confined to the heartland areas. It's also found in Welsh cities. It's found in the diaspora. There are network communities of speakers online. There has been a very good study that actually looked at the way in which people interact through Twitter using through the medium of Welsh. And it shows the big, online networks that exist that, span the world. Okay, and so jumping on then to this is a headline that we saw a few years ago. It could actually be a kind of a pre-Brexit maybe kind of headline, but the headline was England's second language is Polish. So there was a huge number of Polish migrants who went to live in the UK, who settled there, who set up shops, and while they were there, of course, they acquired English as a second language. Multilingualism and forced displacement, of course, as we have known in recent years, has meant that there's a lot of people moving around to different places because they're forced to move around. And with them, they bring their own linguistic resources as well. So we find, a huge movement of Ukrainian, for example, which we didn't have previously. Syrian, for example, and the lots of other displaced migrants that resettle in other countries around the world. A big problem, of course, is for politicians and for policymakers is managing multilingualism. So the management of multilingualism is often presented as a problem that needs to be solved as opposed to something that's a resource that needs to be harnessed. So if you hear, the political debate around multilingualism, it's often presented as a big problem, and it's not something that a lot of politicians really buy into that much. And I suppose one of the reasons is that our systems are already very stretched, and because we live in very monolingual regimes. So if you compare European countries to places like India or South Africa, where multilingualism is much more the norm, here we're not used to multilingualism. And it's this idea that, well, you're in France, so you should speak French. Or you're in Germany, speak German. In the UK, you speak English. So it's that kind of mentality that we have. And so societies, particularly in Europe and in the Western world generally, are ill-prepared for multilingualism. And there's little desire to seriously engage with the opportunities and challenges of new speakers in a multilingual world. So this was something that a group of researchers, spanning 28 different countries, began to explore a number of years ago. And we were interested in looking at the opportunities and challenges that new speakers face in a multilingual world. So we looked at different contexts in which indigenous minority languages, such as Irish, Galician, Basque, and Breton, were being revitalized because of their use in other contexts, online, in cities, etc. And we were also interested in looking at migration and transnational workers and how these people were settling into their communities as new speakers of English or French or German, whatever, but also the extent to which they were maintaining their home languages. The new speaker is defined here as multilingual citizens who engage in languages other than their native or national language. And when they do so, they find themselves crossing existing social boundaries, re-evaluating their own linguistic competence, and having to creatively restructure their social practices to adapt to new and overlapping linguistic spaces. Put simply, a new speaker refers to anyone who embarks on a journey acquiring and becoming a speaker of a new language. And this journey can be rewarding, but can also involve challenges. So I'm sure a lot of you in the room could be considered new speakers. Like, how many of you would you consider yourself new speakers of English? Yeah? What other kind of new speakers do we have? What other languages are you learning or acquiring? So do many of you speak German, for example, as a second language? Mm-hmm. Any other languages? Spanish? Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's a range of, in the modern world, I think a lot of people acquire second language at school, and then to varying degrees, they continue to speak it. One of the most widely learned language, of course, is English, which is the lingua franca. And there are more non-native speakers of English in the world than native speakers. And there's a whole movement about new Englishes being produced. So the legitimacy or the authority of the native speaker is going out the window a little bit, because it's no longer the case that the legitimate way of speaking English is no longer associated with England, for example, or just a particular place. So people are inventing or creating their own types of Englishes. So this changing dynamic requires a questioning of the older assumptions around language, territory, and nativeness. So the same assumptions that I associated there when I showed you my experience of questioning learning French in Germany. And so there are three interrelated assumptions which have basically informed a lot of research up until quite recently. And these assumptions have also informed the way that people in general think about language, territory, and nativeness. So languages as bounded, discrete, and named entities, territorialized notions of language within bounded communities. So remember there we looked at the idea of French being in France, separated from German in Germany. And when you cross that border, there's a question about, does this other language really belong? And then the whole question of nativeness and the native speaker ideology. Who speaks the best French or who speaks the best English? And it's often associated with the native speaker from France, the native speaker from England, etc. So I'd like to go on and maybe unpack those three assumptions and present you with some new concepts that have been explored in sociolinguistics and applied linguistics in recent years, such as translanguaging, sociolinguistics of mobility, new speakers, and emergent bilinguals. And I'm going to discuss some real-world examples. And I know, I understand that you are all doing a degree in teacher education. So I've based my example on a multilingual context in a school. So it may give you some inspiration, or it may resonate with some of your own experience in either working with schools or things that you may work with in the future. And then we'll reflect on some of the dilemmas that teachers face, policymakers face, and language advocates face. So historicizing language, territoriality, and nativeness in the context of European nation states. So if you look at the map here, you can see the borders around the different countries. And each of these borders then corresponds to the name of a country. And usually the name of the country is very much linked to the language. So French in France, Spanish in Spain, you have Polish in Poland, etc. So you have these very territorial ways of designating language. And this is not something that is natural. So, this was not the natural way of things. Before nation states were formed, there was much more fluidity with populations, that they didn't have the same sort of ethno-linguistic construction of what identity was. But with the nation state, people began to associate speaking a certain language with the country. So to have a particular type of identity, to be French, one of the characteristics that you needed to have was that you needed to be a French speaker. And because of that, a lot of the other linguistic minorities now in France were pushed to the periphery. So, for example, if you spoke Breton, this was no longer really legitimate. If you spoke Picard, it wasn't really legitimate. If you spoke Catalan, it wasn't legitimate. So these were pushed to the peripheries. And as you can see in the French context, a lot of these languages are now very peripheral. And it is in a context where French had a very, the French state had a very, I suppose, very good language policy in that sense, in that it imposed French as the only language of France. And it did this quite well if you compare it to places like Spain. In Spain, languages like Galician, Catalan, and Basque are very much more alive than in a French context. So French, they were very good at their language policy around French and eliminating other linguistic diversity in France more generally. So we can historicize language. So language is something that didn't exist really. It's an invention of the nation state. And Woolard talks a lot about this. She talks about languages that became objects of inquiry are recognizable not as natural entities, nor even historical artifacts locatable in actual linguistic practices, but rather prescriptive ideologies. So the fact that, we name French as French or English as English, it's an ideology. It's not something real. It's something that we have invented, or society has invented, very much through the construction of nation states. Nativeness is also, very much an invention, and it's the legacy, the ideological legacy of what started out as, a very, what seemed to be an innocent kinship of metaphors such as mother tongue and native speaker. And we very often use the label mother tongue. It's my mother tongue. So it's my mother tongue, it's my first language, so that means, I must have greater competence than somebody who acquired it as a second language. And that type of ideology continues to exist, and it's very often it's used very often in the context of migration, where people who claim to have the language as their native language will position themselves sometimes as superior to somebody who acquired it as a second language. People who come to different countries as migrants and need to acquire the language, the host language of the state, often are told they speak with an accent. They're often told you don't sound right. When you have an accent, sometimes people, when they go for a job interview, they say, "Oh, you're not from here. Where are you from?" Okay, you're not French, or you're not English, or you're not Spanish. So there, even though the person, it's not explicit that you didn't get the job because of your accent, it sometimes is very influential. There have also been studies which looked at the way attitudes towards different accents and the fact that people have prejudice against certain types of accents. So there was a study done in France a number of years ago which looked at the ability that people had, different populations within France had to rent property. So they did an experiment where somebody with, a French accent from Paris rang up, with a fairly posh accent, sounded educated. They were more likely to be told that they could be rented the property than somebody who rang up who didn't have an authentically French accent. So maybe somebody who had an accent that was notably from somebody who was from African origin, for example, was often discriminated against, or other accents that weren't sounding French. So a lot of discrimination happens on the basis of language and on the way people sound. The idealized native speaker was epitomized the politically and socially dominant ruling class of the time. So in French, it was the variety of the Parisian elite that became dominant. In Spanish, it was the variety of the Castilian court. And in English, it was the variety of Southern English elite. So it's just by chance that because these were the centers of power, that then became the standard language, that became French, Spanish, or English. So it could have been, if the center of power had been in Alsace, it could have been Alsatian. If the center of power, had been in Picardy, we might just all be speaking Picard or Ch'ti. So it's just because the center of power was not there. And, I heard some people laugh when we heard, Ch'ti or Picard, and it's because those ways of speaking are often stigmatized. I know with the film, what was the recent film? Bienvenue c'est les Ch'tis. People started to, think of Ch'ti in different ways. But in general, it's an accent that's, seen as being less prestigious. Sometimes it's joked about. Even some of the southern languages in France are joked about. So if it's not, this standard type of accent, it's seen as something that's not prestigious. And in linguistics and sociolinguistics, these terms were actually taken on board and used very uncritically. So in linguistics, we still use the term native speaker. We still use the term linguistic competence. We still work with standardized languages. We still use the term mother tongue, and we still talk about language, even though it has been shown that these are very problematic concepts that need to be historicized and questioned. So new paradigms have been explored in recent years. So, for example, the first one there by McConey and Penny Cook, who talks about the disinventing of language. So they say, languages don't exist, they never have, and they're just an invention. When I teach language students who are studying modern languages, they find they're a bit disappointed to hear that, because their whole careers are going to be based on, teaching languages or speaking languages. So to be told languages don't exist is not something they like hearing. There's also sociolinguistics of globalization, thinking about languages and speakers on the move, that they're not just associated with a particular geographical area, but that people move around and speak languages in different areas. And then for new speakers, which is the concept that I mentioned earlier on, which is non-native speakers, people who acquire a second language either through migration processes in the context of indigenous minority languages. And so it's a more positive way of framing the non-native speaker. Because sometimes when we talk about non-native speakers, it's stigmatized. You're told, well, you're just a non-native speaker. You're not a real speaker. So there's very much this idea that you're not a full speaker. So this new speaker concept was a way of trying to overcome some of those stigmas and say, well, you're a new speaker. It's something positive. You have an identity as a new speaker. You're not just a learner. Other concepts that exist are emergent bilinguals or multilingual subjects. So emergent bilinguals is this idea that it's celebrating bilingualism. Because for a long time, of course, bilingualism was seen as something that was deficient. Often parents, up until the 1960s, parents would have been told, don't speak, just speak one language to the child because you don't want to confuse them. Children get confused because of bilingualism. But in more recent years, of course, it's been shown that bilingualism is not something that confuses children, but actually enhances their cognitive abilities. So I think you as future teachers in the classroom, it's something I'm supposed to be very aware of. When you have children in the classroom who speak different languages, how to give value to the languages that are spoken in the classroom. And rather than, I suppose, telling them, well, in the classroom we only speak French, that they could be encouraged also to bring their linguistic resources to the classroom and see how the other languages they have can help them actually learn French as opposed to inhibit their learning of French. So we've seen a move from language to languaging, from language and place to languaging across time and space. And we've also seen the move from the non-native speaker to new speakers and emergent bilinguals. Blumert and Rampton have even gone so far as saying that the new speaker has no place in the sociolinguistic toolkit and we should get rid of it altogether. That it's a really good proposition, but I suppose in society, these concepts still continue to exist and we still continue to use them. These new assumptions, of course, are not unproblematic, and so concepts like translanguaging are also problematic in some contexts. New speakers as well, we could say it's a new term, but are we really changing anything in the ground? There's still the tensions between being a new speaker and being a native speaker. And then in terms of place, a lot of people, even though, we talk about virtual communities, people moving around, a lot of people still give a lot of importance to place. So people, often when you meet somebody, you say, oh, you might say, oh, where you're from? I hear an accent in a positive way. You say, oh, I'm from the same place as you. Or being proud of your identity, saying, I'm from such a place. I'm from Scotland, or, I'm from Ireland, and this is my accent, and this is who I am. So I'd now like to go on to talk a little bit about some real-world examples where we can see some of this in practice. And I've chosen a multilingual classroom, and I think it's something maybe you in the future will experience, because multilingual classrooms has become the norm nowadays. Whether you're living in, in the past, it was often associated with being in an urban area, but even in more rural areas now, we can see there's much more multilingualism and diversity. So this is a book that was written a few years ago by Christine Hello and Mura Jolir. It's a pity Christine isn't here. And it was on language policy for the multilingual classroom, pedagogy of the possible. So it was a book that brought together different case studies of multilingual classrooms in different parts of the world and how teachers were managing multilingualism, or how parents were managing multilingualism and how children were engaging with multilingual classrooms. So I was very lucky to have a chapter in that book, and that was how I got to know Christine, and then, by default, got to know Aaron, and that's why I'm here. If it hadn't been for that book, I wouldn't have got to know all of this and known all these people. So the chapter that I wrote for this book was called Negotiating Multilingualism in an Irish Primary School Context. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Irish context. You're familiar with it? I can just give a little brief overview for people who may not be as familiar with it. Up until a number of decades ago, I suppose till maybe up until the 90s, Ireland was a place of out-migration. People left the country. It was a place, in Europe, which it had, very low economic growth. People used to, immigrate to the UK, immigrate to the US because there weren't jobs. But from the 90s, Ireland experienced what was called the Celtic Tiger, and it was an economic boom which really changed the whole country, in the space of a few years. Big tech companies moved into Ireland. You had, Google, Microsoft. You had a very educated Irish population who then began to work in these sectors. And because the economy was booming, this attracted people from outside the country. So you had, for the first time ever really, in-migration to Ireland. So, we had people coming from other parts of Europe, for example, Poland, other Eastern European countries. A lot of Spanish people came to live in Ireland. And people from all over the world basically came. So Ireland was never a monolingual country, in that we have also a second language which is used, which is Irish. Irish is the official language of the country, even though English is the language that's predominantly used. So we have a history of bilingualism. But this multilingualism that arrived, people weren't ready for it. And teachers in schools in particular were not prepared at all how to deal with a multilingual classroom. And this is an example of a multilingual classroom where, there were up to 20 different languages, spoken in the school. In Ireland at the time, it was estimated that about 100 different languages were reported in the census. And so teachers, arrived into the classroom, and they suddenly were faced with children who didn't have much English. The teachers had no background in language teaching. They didn't really know how to cope. So how do you deal with a child that's totally silent for the first 6 months? They just won't talk because they don't know how to talk. And how do you get over that barrier? And how do you ensure that a child, even if they are talking, that they are actually learning, because maybe they don't understand everything? They may have acquired English, but maybe it's a very basic English. It's a type of English maybe that's, they don't do much reading in it, etc. So there are all these kinds of difficulties. So looking at this multilingual classroom, we can ask questions about how older assumptions around language and territory and nativeness are playing out on the ground in multilingual and linguistic diverse contexts such as this, and how are teachers managing multilingualism in their classrooms. So when I went to the school, I was met by, people were very welcoming of me coming into the school. They were very excited that, I was developing a language awareness project. They were very aware that they needed support, they needed ideas on how to manage multilingualism. And we had a focus group discussion the first day, and this is one of the responses from the English language support teacher. And so I'll just read out what he said. He said, one of the difficulties that we have is when a child comes to the school and has no English at all, and the parents don't have English either. The parents will speak their own language at home rather than practicing English and trying to incorporate it as part of their home language. In the interest of the child, parents should make an effort to speak the language that the children are learning at school. So this was the approach that the English language support teacher told me that he took. When children came to school, it was, oh, you need to get, English is, the primary thing here. You need to start speaking English as quickly as possible. And he was quite critical of parents who he said, weren't speaking English to their children at home, even though, Polish. Why would you as a Polish speaker speak English to your child? Or you as a French speaker speak English to your child? It sometimes feels very unnatural, or you kind of think, well, am I going to be speaking broken English even if I do that? So you can see the language he uses is quite negative. So he said one of the difficulties, so it's seen as a problem. The child comes to the school with no English, and sometimes that's not true. They can have some English. The parents don't have English either. They will only speak their own language. The parents should make an effort. So that's one of the key. So it's, their fault. It's their fault. They came to this country. They need to integrate. So all of this kind of negative type of discourse that's been used. When I went to the school, the idea was that I would create language awareness activities for to help teachers embed this in the classroom, engage with parents, and also get children using their own language. And so it was decided that I would work with the early years classroom, which was the 4 to 5 year olds. And the reason for that was it was seen as the least disruptive, and this was where less serious learning would happen. So this more serious learning and the literacy was, for the older children. And this was, there were 4 to 5 year olds. It was going to be a lot of play, a lot of, not really serious stuff yet. And so there was less focus on reading, writing, and literacy. So I was told, well, go into that classroom, be fine. It won't be disruptive. In earlier observations as well, what I also noticed was the way in which things were being presented. So it wasn't as if multilingualism was not being celebrated in the school. It was, and they were very aware of multilingualism. But if you look at the way it was celebrated, for example, you come back to the territorial way of thinking about language. So flags were all over the place. There were flags or images of food. So this, I suppose, is a very easy way of, you can't blame the teachers because if they don't have other resources. So it's an easy way for teachers to gather information. On the internet, you can say, okay, I look up French, I look up Spanish, I look up Arabic, and you do come up with a lot of these symbols. And, food, etc., and everybody identifies with that. So it's an easy way of celebrating diversity in the classroom. You can see there they have the map of the countries, and the children would put the flags on the map. Etc. But this was problematic in some ways because very often the languages that teachers thought were used by the children were not the languages they were using in the home. So, for example, a child might come from a particular country. There was one child, I think, that came from Hungary, and so the presumption was the child was a Hungarian speaker, but it turned out they weren't a Hungarian speaker. Their parents were Polish, and so the parents spoke to the child in Polish. And so that was never discovered because when children came to the school, they would have to talk about what was their country of origin. So there was an awful lot of tick boxing kind of going on, with misidentification of people's languages or their dialects even. There was also some discussion about written languages and non-written languages. So there were some children, for example, who came from cultures where the language they spoke wasn't written down. It was an oral language. And often teachers would say, but how can this be? Like all languages are written. And they would send a note home to the parents and they'd say, well, can you write the word for hello in your language? And they wouldn't get a response. And then they would think, well, the parents are just not interested. We'll try again. And they still wouldn't get a response. And eventually they discovered some of this because we organised some focus group discussions, and we also developed multilingual books. And parents actually came into the classroom and explained the situation and said, no, we don't have a written word for that because it's an oral language. So there's a complete miscomprehension sometimes about the nature of language. So again, thinking back to these three assumptions that I mentioned earlier, we can see ideas about language as bounded, discrete entities, territorialized notions of language, and the native speaker ideology. So if I had just based my analysis on that focus group or on my early observations, I would have gone away thinking, this is a school, they're superficially in favor of multilingual, but really they're not committed. The teachers aren't committed. They seem to have, a lack of understanding about how multilingualism works, and they're not really engaged with multilingual children. And it was only because I actually stayed there for years, so I used to come every Friday, that I discovered that really what was going on at a grassroots level was actually very different. And the English for support teacher, who you heard earlier, who was quite, who was saying they need to learn English as quickly as possible, parents need to be speaking English. This language support teacher actually created a multilingual haven in his classroom. So he created bilingual storybooks. He created dictionaries. He went out of his way to order dictionaries online. He used sometimes go to, certain countries that were associated with the children in the classroom. He would often go visit them on his holidays as a way of learning a little bit more about the culture. And he used translanguaging as a tool where he encouraged children to speak their own language in classroom, and he would try, through the use of translation tools and dictionaries, to understand what they were saying in their own language. And then he would try and pick up a few words. They would then throw in some English. So it was really a multilingual type of scenario. And he had very positive attitudes towards multilingualism and in supporting multilingualism. So there seemed to be a mismatch between expressed beliefs and practices. So what was going on here? Why did he tell me, this thing on the first day when he told me, no, they need to learn English as quickly as possible. Parents should be teaching them English. They shouldn't be speaking their own languages. Why was there this big mismatch between this monolingual type of ideology and the very multilingual practices he was displaying in the classroom? And I suppose one way of explaining this is to look at the structure versus agency type of framework that, influences very much everything in society. And so the big debate in social science is are we being influenced by the structure, or is there enough agency at the bottom to bring about change? So there's a great debate about the interplay between our organizational structures, the rules that are in place, and the agency or the freedom that we have in bringing about change. So where does the permission come from to enact the change that we need to see? And is it externally generated by those in positions of power, or is it internally generated by a personal motivation? So, for example, you as teachers, can you bring about change in your classroom despite the very monolingual type of ideologies that exists, at a nation state level? Or is are the policies so powerful that even if you try to bring about change, that it's not possible? So we saw that agency is an internal personal motivation. So teachers in the school that I worked with had a desire to give voice to children in the classroom. That was very clear, that they were very much supportive of giving children a voice in as much as they could. They had a very favourable disposition to diversity and inclusion, and they were supportive of the ideal of multilingualism in the classroom. So that was apparent with, the efforts that they made in trying to seek out resources. And they also supported translanguaging practices in that they did encourage children to speak their own languages. They did try to understand them. They would try to learn some words from their languages. At the other end, then you had the structure or the external pressures and rules, which were constantly stopping them from doing some of the innovative work that they really wanted to do. So there was an overarching policy of monolingualism in Ireland at the time, albeit sometimes de facto. So there was this at a state level, they were supporting bilingualism and they were saying, well, yeah, multilingualism is good. But really, the discourse was a monolingual discourse. The schools were under pressure to show that they had increased in English language literacy. And because this was it was a school in a deprived inner city area, they received a lot of funding from the government. And in return, they had to prove that they had increased children's literacy skills. So they would have to do tests, children would have to do tests every year, and then the school would be measured to see their performance. So the teachers were under huge pressure. If they didn't perform at the end of the year, potentially some of their funding could be cut, or the head teacher would be reprimanded as to, what's going on in the school. Why aren't you showing results? There was also a requirement that children would complete standardized tests very often. So instead of having tests to suit bilingual children were tested as if they were monolingual English speakers. And obviously, they won't perform the same way. And obviously, they were showing worse results. Good English was, of course, teachers were very aware of this, that good English is a requirement to get a good job. So they knew that even if, they were allowing children to mix English with their own languages in the classroom, once they left the classroom, they were in the big bad world where English or good English was the requirement. And when they went on to do exams, they needed to write proper English. When they went to a job interview later on in life, they couldn't go into a job interview translanguaging and speaking mixture of their own language and English. They just wouldn't get the job. So teachers were very aware of that, and teachers, of course, it's their role to equip children to be able to have these skills, to go out into the world and to be able to be part of society and to work in society. So this is just a brief excerpt from a well-known Irish journalist at the time. I think the discourse has maybe changed since then, but this is quite a negative discourse to show you some of the more negative attitudes that exist at a societal level. And this journalist says there has to be massive reform in the Irish education system. The state sector has to be expanded, and we have to have a doctrine of coping with foreign languages in our schools. For example, there's good reason to outlaw foreign languages being spoken at the playground, because the playground is the primary area for them to learn about the culture of the school and the society they're in. It's good to have foreigners in Ireland, but it's not good to have them create a separate culture in their school. So very, very negative language here, coping with foreign languages rather than saying celebrating foreign languages. And he's saying outlawing them, which is even more, it's very dictatorial altogether. And then creating a separate culture. He's saying, they can't be creating separate cultures. They need to integrate and be like us as quickly as possible. So I suppose it's very often a careful balancing act for teachers. So for you as teachers teaching in the future, even though you need to be aware of these older assumptions around language, territory, and nativeness, and the existence of newer ones of translanguaging, mobility, new speakers, which move you away from some of the deficiency models. We also need to be aware that while at the same time we need to give voice to multilingualism, multilingual children, they also need to learn the rules of the game, as Bourdieu would have said. So if the children don't know how to survive in a society which is very much not friendly to multilingualism and not friendly to difference in a lot of ways, if children are not prepared for that when they grow up, then you're setting them up for failure. So they need to be given a voice, but at the same time they need to be aware that society isn't moving fast enough. You might have an idealized world that you can create in the classroom, but the classroom doesn't always replicate what the real world might look like. So just some final reflections then. Older assumptions needs to be critiqued. I think we very much need to historicize the assumptions that we make and questions that we haven't, the ideal native speaker or the fact that we associate somebody with a particular place or we say they speak with an accent. We need to be very reflective on our own practices. New labels are very good, but they also present new challenges and dilemmas. And I think we need some sort of a middle ground which allows us to critique the traditional type of ways of thinking, but also be aware of some of the newer, most postmodernist understanding of language, which basically are in some ways idealist, and in the society in which we live, we are not yet really living in a postmodern society. We're still living very much at the edges of traditional ways of thinking. So back to my start, a French language exchange in Bulle, well, why not? Thank you.
Merci, thank you beaucoup. Thank you beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Thank you for your talk, Bernadette. That was really interesting. I hope you managed to follow, perhaps not everything, but the main points. I would like you to ask a few questions, make some comments, maybe talk to Bernadette about your own experiences. Vous avez aussi eu des expériences par rapport à ces questions de langue. Oui, merci beaucoup.
I had a question about Irish and specifically the way it's taught in school in Ireland, because I was teaching in Ireland and all the kids basically told me the teaching of Irish was very bad. Mm-hmm. So what do you think we could do to give the kids more want to learn the language and to help them actually get it?
Yeah, so Irish is an obligatory subject in all schools. So in primary schools, it's part of all of the curriculum, and a secondary school is usually taught as a subject. And then there are special schools called Gaelscoileanna, so the immersion schools, which is completely to the medium of Irish. But there has been I suppose since a very long time, a language policy in Ireland came into place in the 1920s. So when it came into place at that point, there was a very draconian kind of way of teaching Irish in that it was seen as an imposition. People saw it as something that they were forced to learn. And often it was seen as a difficult subject. In the early years of language policy, it was linked to, so you had to pass the Irish, the equivalent of le bac at the end of your secondary school. You had to pass that. You had to pass Irish in that exam. And if you didn't pass, you would fail your leaving cert, which is the equivalent of the bac. So people began to associate failure at school with failure in Irish. So it created a very negative kind of link. Other people then are quite, didn't like Irish at school because of the type of curriculum that was taught. So in the earlier years, there was a book that was used called Peg Sayers. So it's Peg Sayers was an old woman who lived in the Blasket Islands, and so it was about at school, children had to learn about her miserable, downtrodden life. So this was the kind of picture of Irishness. School children learned about the misery that Peg, who was a 70-year-old woman living in an island off the coast of Ireland where it rained all the time, and her miserable life. So people started associating Irish with Peg. And it wasn't until the 1990s that they set up an Irish language television. And then on Irish language television, they began to see young people speaking Irish, really, people who were, their own age, having fun speaking Irish. So, and, programs that you would see on English language television were now appearing in Irish language television. So that changed attitudes to some extent. But I suppose in schools, attitudes towards Irish will depend on, your parents' attitudes. It will depend on sometimes the type of teacher that you have. So some people, who have a good experience with a teacher will actually like Irish. There's some criticism of the curriculum that there should be more focus on learning the oral language, so that there seems to be a lot of focus on learning written Irish or stories. So there isn't really a solution in the sense that I think children need to be aware that there's more to learning language in the classroom, and that there should be more facilities outside of it. So like creating youth clubs in Irish, creating opportunities for children to meet other Irish speakers. So that it's just not just about learning in a book, but that it's a living language. But, you know, I agree that, you know, it has a reputation of not being taught very well. But in the same way as teaching languages, you know, teaching French, teaching German, Spanish, you get the same story. People will say, you know, people are taught languages badly in general. And it's a kind of it's not as bad as in the UK, but, you know, we're quite bad at teaching languages. And I think in France as well, you know, there's a reputation of not teaching languages that well. If you compare it to maybe some of the Nordic countries like Sweden and Finland, where everybody can speak, you know, several languages and don't have a problem with it. Whereas I know from experience living in Spain as well, they're really obsessed with learning English, and they start learning English, you know, before they can walk. But then most of them, you know, don't really speak well in English. And why is that? You know, I suppose one of the reasons could be that, you know, television programs are dubbed, so they don't hear the language as much as you would in places like Finland and Sweden. And as Finland and Sweden, I suppose, and Nordic countries, to survive, sometimes they have to speak English. And they, you know, have a very kind of positive attitude towards learning English. Whereas I suppose in France, people will say, well, you know, why do I have to learn English? You know, I speak French. Why aren't we all speaking French? So there's that kind of approach as well. Not as bad, I suppose, you know, as in, you know, English-speaking countries like the UK, where, you know, they will say, "What, you know, why would you bother ever learning a language? Because everybody speaks English."
Yeah, it's the big problem of the English-speaking countries.
Yeah.
Another question, comments?
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I just had two questions. The first one was about the concept of new speaker. And I wondered, when are you not considered as a new speaker anymore? Is there like a transition from new speaker to, I don't know, a regular second language speaker?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. And it's something that we debated, you know, very much as part of the network. When do you stop becoming a new speaker and just a speaker? And I don't know, did you see one of the slides that I had was from new speaker to speaker? And I suppose people, you know, when they throw away these kind of labels, when they say, well, I just want to be considered a speaker for what I am. You know, I'm no longer... you know, I may still have an accent, or I may still, you know, make grammatical mistakes, but I'm still a speaker of this language. And so they can sometimes reject then being called a new speaker. But I suppose the idea of being a new speaker was seen as something more positive. You know, you're called a new speaker as opposed to something, you're a non-native speaker, which was seen, well, you're still very deficient. Whereas new speaker was kind of celebrating the fact that you were, you know, a bilingual and that you'd acquired a new language. But it's a good point that, you know, some people would just want to be called a speaker. Yeah.
And when you talked about that, and at some point you talked about competences, and I think with the French system, sometimes we like to talk about English skills, compétences langagières that you have to acquire with A1, A2, and so on. And you said it was also very problematic in social linguistics, and I wanted you to just develop on that, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's been a lot of debate around it as well, because competence is very much defined, you know, putting people into certain categories. So, you know, you're defined as competent according to a certain number of criteria. If you don't fulfill those, you're deemed incompetent. And so I suppose competence is much more about those kind of skills. It's about all the other types of skills, about, you know, adhering to social norms of language, being able to communicate in general. And it's sometimes, you know, when people do tests, you're often, you know, judged on those very strict criteria. For example, when, you know, people are assessed on their level of English, particularly in the context of migration, and they're told you have to reach a certain level of competence if you are to, for example, get benefits. You have to show that you have a certain level of competence. So, it's very, it can be used as a way of excluding people from different things. So that's where the danger is, I think. In itself, you could say, it's quite good maybe to have these kind of things to help people get to a certain level. But then when it's used in these kind of ways to exclude people, it becomes problematic.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering, I will come back to the concept of new speaker. And I'm not sure I have understood well, but do you think that the children who speak and learn their heritage language are considered as new speakers? And can we consider children who are growing up bilingual or multilingual as new speakers? How do you see
Yeah, you can. Well, I suppose the new speaker label, it can be used in, lots and lots of different ways. And sometimes we have, kind of thought rather than using it as a label or a category, that it could be used as a lens. So basically this idea that it would allow you, you talk about a new speaker theorization, if you like, to allow you to look at issues around legitimacy, issues around being an authoritative speaker, issues about whether or not you are considered to be on the same level as a native speaker. So in that respect, you could say, heritage speakers are sometimes delegitimized because they're sometimes seen to maybe not speak either language properly. Sometimes the heritage language, they can be seen to be deficient in it because, they may not be able to write in it. They can maybe speak, but only in a particular domain. And they could be considered new speakers in that respect, in that they are, they sometimes lack the nativeness associated with a real native speaker. I'll give you an example of, in Ireland, some parents in Dublin, have decided to bring up their children speaking Irish, even though they weren't brought up speaking Irish themselves. So you can say, to what extent is that child a native speaker of Irish? Some people would say they're not real native speakers because they weren't brought up in the traditional heartlands. And other people would say, well, they are native speakers because they've spoken it all their lives. And even though they don't sound like the traditional native speakers, they have Dublin Irish. So they're creating a new type of speaker.
Une autre question?
Concerning Irish, I don't know if you heard of the band Kneecap.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that kind of initiatives can help young people want to learn Irish or just learn Irish and be better at it?
Well, I think, groups like that, who engage a lot of maybe controversial type of issues, definitely engage younger people. And there have been a lot of studies, worldwide where they've shown where learning a minoritized language through the medium of rap is one way of engaging younger generations. So more of those kind of initiatives would be really welcome. I think is in Wales, there was Welsh, and the revitalisation of Welsh was linked to popular music, which attracted younger people. And in Catalonia, you can see that quite prominently as well. So definitely, that is the way forward. Younger generations, they don't necessarily want to listen to traditional music. They want to listen to other types of music. I know. One person, sometimes we associate learning a minoritized language with having to buy into all of that, Celtic mysticism, if you like. But I know a person in Glasgow, and he's in his 50s now, but he's a heavy metal fan, and he lives in the city of Glasgow. He learned Gaelic as an adult, and he speaks fluently in Gaelic, but he hates traditional music. absolutely hates, anything to do with Gaelic traditional music. He says, he'd like to see more heavy metal bands in Gaelic. And I think you need that diversity because associating the minority culture with, traditions of the past is not always the way forward.
Thanks very much for that talk. It was a real pleasure to watch a talk from you. I've never had that opportunity. As sociolinguists, obviously, we're all about the critique of the native speaker, exploring this sort of non-native speaker binary. But I'm curious, something I've never really come across in the data or in any articles I've read, is the possibility that a speaker could identify with this non-native label as a sort of safety net, as a sort of justification for a perceived lack of competence, and as a sort of galvanizing thing almost because they surpass expectations that are associated with this label. And I wonder if that came out in any of the field work you did or any of the work that was done with your colleagues.
Yeah, so I think there are people who prefer to keep using the non-native type of terminology because of the reasons that you said, that it is, and they feel that they position themselves as a non-native as a way of saying, I'm not perfect, I'm not a native speaker, and I don't really want to be, or I'm fine not being a native speaker. There has been work done which kind of says, changing the labels doesn't necessarily change anything, because if you call yourself a new speaker, you're still positioning yourself as a dichotomy, you're new speaker, old speaker. And when we started looking at that, it was a real problem as to, what label we would use. And the reason we used new speaker was because it existed already in Basque and Galician. Neofalante and Euskaldunberri is the word in Basque. So people were already using that. And maybe it hasn't translated as well to English. Some people have critiqued the new speaker concept. Some people have, said it sounds Orwellian because of newspeak, which has negative connotations. And some people have said, this is just another fancy label, that's been used like translanguaging. But it did serve our purpose to kind of, get a big group of people together to talk about these issues and to debate them. And I think if we started out by just saying we're talking about speakers, we wouldn't have been able to zone in on the type of issues affecting this category of speakers, the new speakers or the non-native speakers.
Encore une question? Commentaire? Remarque?
So I wondered, have you already done teacher training practice in the classrooms, or have you already experienced multilingual classrooms yourselves? Yeah.
When I was in Ireland, I was in County Dublin, Lucan. And
It's
so,
that's very multilingual, yeah.
Yeah, most of the kids weren't from like a pure Irish background.
Yeah.
So a lot of them spoke different languages, and even some of them just like came. I had a kid who was from Moldova. He came right on to the school year and he didn't speak a word of English.
Yeah.
It was hard for him. Thankfully, we had a Romanian teacher who could help him, but he felt very isolated, I think. But it helped me teach them French because, for example, those who could speak Arabic, it helped them with the pronunciation of the R. Those who spoke Spanish, well, they were very helped as well. Those who spoke Romanian as well were very helped by the fact that it's a Romance language.
Yeah.
So I think there was a huge diversity in those classrooms, and it actually helped them a lot. Although some of them, even though they were completely bilingual, didn't seem to grasp the concept that not everything was akin to English. So I don't know. It helped some of them, not others, I suppose.
Yeah, but it's interesting what you say. Teachers, when they're in these kind of situations, they have to make do with the resources they have. And so in an ideal world, you could say, well, the teachers should be, attentive to all the, the children who don't have English or French as their first language. But in a classroom where you may have, 20 children, how do you manage in that kind of context? You can't do it. And I think teachers, the classrooms are getting too big and teachers aren't, getting enough resources, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's interesting, if I can just add what you just said about how the fact that they spoke another language helped them with the learning of French as a foreign language, because very often, unfortunately, what you hear is, oh no, let's keep them away from the foreign languages because they've already got enough problems trying to learn the school language, which is such a shame because they often excel in the foreign language classroom compared to them monolingual peers.
And in Ireland, for example, there's a rule that if you come to Ireland after the age of 7, you're exempt from Irish. And so that excludes, lots of multilingual children who are, just dying to learn Irish. And sometimes the children would be sitting at the back of the classroom because they don't have to learn Irish. And they sometimes learn Irish much better than the Irish children themselves because they're already multilingual. And, learning Irish is just another language they can add to their repertoire.
D'autres commentaires? D'autres témoignages?
Thank you so much for your talk. It was so interesting, and it made me think of an experience I had when I first arrived in Scotland, in Inverness. Mm-hmm. I found myself, after 9 years of learning academic English, at Inverness bus station, asking for directions to go to Bewley. And I had this old man in front of me, bless his soul, and I could not understand anything in his answer because I could not understand his accent. Yeah. So maybe a diversity in the sources, in the accent that we learn, should be a good idea when we learn English, because such situations are quite embarrassing because I just acted like I understood everything. I was like, oh, thank you so much. And then I just
walked away.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, when we learn a foreign language at school, we're just often exposed to the standard. And I suppose in one way, initially at least, you have to have some kind of common way of teaching everybody. But I suppose as you progress in your skills, you do need, and you obviously had a good level of English by the time you went to Scotland, but when you got there, you felt like, you had no competence at all because you couldn't understand anything. And exposing people to, and it is about, because sometimes I remember when I moved to Scotland first, Edinburgh not so much because it has a much more standardised accent, but Glasgow, for example, there are some parts of Glasgow, I wouldn't understand their accent, and I speak English. So it's, being aware of different accents and varieties, and I suppose maybe having a tolerance towards that as well. But we obviously aren't exposed enough, and sometimes then we have prejudice about certain types of accents, which doesn't help either. Thanks.
Sorry. I think that's a really interesting comment because the same thing happened to me when I arrived a very long time ago in France. I'd learned French at university. And I was in a hall of residence in Cité Universitaire. I couldn't understand the other students because they were all speaking slang. And we never learnt slang. So the first thing I did was buy a slang dictionary. And then I worked, one of my first jobs at the INSPE, SP, UFM, where there was a colleague who was actually an inspector of English. And he said to me, so where are you from? And I said, I'm from the north of England. I'm from Yorkshire. And he said, oh, do you have an accent? And I was getting a bit fed up of this kind of thing by then. And I said, yeah, everybody has an accent. And he said, well, you have to know that here we only teach the Queen's English. And I said, oh, that's going to be quite difficult then for the students when they go to
Because they won't be going to visit the Queen.
They're not going to visit the Queen, no. And then he proceeded to tell me a story about getting a taxi in London, and the cab driver, who obviously spoke Cockney, London English, yeah? And he said, I didn't understand a word he said, and he was so proud of it. And I just found that just so ridiculous. And it makes me think, is there some kind of snobism as well associated with this, right accent? And it's not a question of native speaker there, because obviously the taxi driver was a native speaker, but not the right kind of native speaker.
Not the native,
Yeah, and the idea of territory as well is really interesting, because he came from the capital city, the right territory, normally, but then you have, like you say, the children the family you were in Germany, the French family.
Yeah.
Are they native speakers?
Yeah.
Yeah. My kids, their langue maternelle, my language is English. Yeah. Their father's is French. They speak English, but when they speak English, they don't have an accent, a regional accent.
Yeah.
And people say, where are you from? Yeah. So are they native? It's a very
but I suppose,
fuzzy.
Yeah, and I suppose
concept,
it's because we're so obsessed with these kind of definitions and labels. And I think it is because, it's a very Western European thing as well. I think, if you look at multilingual contexts like, India or South Africa, it's very different. They have a very different approach. Some people will say they're multilingual and, they might speak 10 languages, but that doesn't mean that they speak 10 languages in all domains. So they might say, I speak such and such a language for going shopping, another language for doing, for work, another language for, whatever else. And with us, it's this idea of having, competence, complete competence in a language is what you think you need to strive when, you don't really. You don't need to be a complete bilingual. And I think bilinguals are very often incomplete in a lot of ways because, as you say, you may learn the language at home. The language you learn might be quite colloquial. You may never learn to read in the language. You may never, give an academic lecture in the language because you may not ever have to. But you're still bilingual.
Bon. S'il n'y a plus de questions brûlantes, je pense qu'on peut encore remercier notre invité ce soir.